What my mother recognized back then, and what I understand now, is that grief is the most painful experience that any child or parent can endure.
A quiet discovery by Prince William has just ignited the most explosive family feud since the passing of the Queen. The future king reportedly caught Camilla's daughter, Laura Lopez, attempting to seize a piece of Princess Diana's sacred legacy, a territory Laura has absolutely no blood right to touch. But it's William's immediate silent counterstrike that has left court insiders completely paralyzed with shock. Why did Laura think she could get away with this? And how far did William just go to completely banish her from royal territory? We are breaking down the exact asset Laura tried to claim, and the devastating revenge William just unleashed to protect his mother's memory. Diana's legacy as living power. Diana Spencer died in a tunnel in Paris in August 1997. She was 36 years old. The world stopped. What happened in the days that followed her death was unlike anything the modern monarchy had ever produced or ever had to manage. The flowers outside Kensington Palace accumulated until they formed a carpet that stretched further than anyone could measure. The queues to sign the condolence books wound through central London for hours. The television coverage ran without interruption for days. An estimated 2.5 billion people watched her funeral. 2.5 billion. There is no other event in the history of the British monarchy that comes close to that number. That was nearly 30 years ago, and the power has not diminished. This is the fact that the palace has never fully known what to do with. Monarchies are built on continuity, on the steady, reliable accumulation of institutional authority across generations. They are not built for singular and blazing emotional connection, the kind that Diana generated with the public during her lifetime, and that her death somehow intensified rather than extinguished. That kind of connection does not fit neatly into the machinery of constitutional monarchy. It does not follow the rules, nor does it observe the protocols. It simply exists. It's enormous and ungovernable, and whoever controls access to it holds something the palace cannot manufacture on its own. William understands this. He has understood it for a long time. Watch the way he has built his public role over the past 15 years, and the strategy becomes clear. The Royal Foundation, established in 2011, was never simply a vehicle for good causes. It was a framework, a structure through which Diana's values. She used the foundation to reach outer to the people the establishment preferred to overlook, like the homeless, the mentally ill, and the young people falling through every crack the system offered could be channeled into something durable and institutionally credible. Something that would last beyond any single campaign, headline, or moment of public attention. The mental health work came first, and it came deliberately. Together, the campaign William launched alongside Catherine and Harry in 2016 drew directly on the conversation Diana had begun decades earlier. She had spoken about her own struggles at a time when no public figure, let alone a member of the royal family, spoke about such things. She had visited AIDS patients when the disease was still surrounded by fear and stigma. She had sat with the dying, the addicted, and the abandoned. She had made the uncomfortable visible. William took that instinct and built an institution around it. The Earthshot Prize extended the framework further, named with a deliberate echo of the moonshot ambition, one that defined a previous generation's sense of what was possible. It planted William's public identity at the intersection of global urgency and practical hope. It was Diana's emotional register applied to a 21st century crisis. The connection was never made explicit. It did not need to be. Anyone paying attention could see the line running from mother to son. This is not sentiment, it is strategy. And it is a strategy of a remarkably sophisticated kind. Because what William has done, carefully and consistently over more than a decade, is ensure that Diana's legacy is not a museum piece. It is not a charity gala held once a year where people who remember the 1980s raise a glass to a woman, especially a woman who once changed the way the monarchy related to the public. It is a living, funded, institutionally embedded force that generates real outcomes in the real world, and that carries her name and her values forward into conversations happening right now. The scale of what that represents is difficult to overstate. Diana's name attached to a cause still moves people in ways that no communications team can replicate artificially. It opens doors and generates donations. It brings people into rooms who would not otherwise come. Her name carries a moral authority that was built not through protocol or ceremony, but through genuine human connection repeated thousands of times across a public life that lasted less than 2 decades. William is the custodian of that authority, not by accident, but by design. His design, executed patiently and with a clarity of purpose that the palace has not always made easy. There have been moments of tension along the way. Decisions about how Diana's memory should be honored publicly, what events should mark her anniversaries, how her image and her words should be used and by whom, have not always been straightforward inside the family. Harry's departure from royal life added a complicated layer to all of it. The brothers who had once stood together at their mother's funeral and built something meaningful in her name found themselves on opposite sides of a divide that showed no sign of closing. That divide affected everything, including the question of who speaks for Diana now and with what authority. William's answer to that question has been consistent. He speaks for her. The royal foundation speaks for her. The work speaks for her. And the boundaries around that work, around who gets to invoke her name, in what context, and toward what ends, are boundaries that William monitors. He monitors it with an attention that people inside his household describe as absolute. This is the landscape into which Laura Lopes stepped, not dramatically, not with any visible declaration of intent, but step into it she did. And the territory she moved toward was not empty, unguarded, or available to anyone who happened to wander close to it. It was the most carefully protected ground in the entire monarchy, watched over by a man who had lost his mother at 15 years old, a man who had walked behind her coffin in front of the entire world, and had spent the 30 years since making certain that what she stood for would not be diluted, redirected, or quietly absorbed by people, especially by those who had not earned the right to stand anywhere near it. Laura Lopes had grown up inside the orbit of the woman who, in the public imagination and in William's private one, bore a significant share of responsibility for what Diana had suffered. That context did not make her guilty of anything, but it made her proximity to Diana's legacy a matter that William was never going to observe without a response. The only question was what form that response would take. Laura Lopes and the quiet repositioning. Nobody chooses the family they are born into. Laura Lopes did not choose to be Camilla Parker Bowles' daughter. She did not choose to grow up in the shadow of one of the most contentious relationships in modern British history. She did not choose to have Camilla as her mother, the most hated woman in Britain, and then, through a rehabilitation that took decades and enormous institutional effort, the Queen of England, she simply lived with it. And for a long time, she lived with it remarkably well. Laura Lopes built a life that was deliberately, almost studiedly, her own. An art gallery career, a relatively low public profile, a marriage to Harry Lopes, a former model turned businessman with whom she has 3 children. She attended the required royal occasions and smiled in the required photographs. Camilla said nothing that could be quoted against her, and did nothing that could be used to construct a damaging narrative. For someone in her position, that kind of sustained discretion is not easy. It requires constant awareness of where the edges are and careful management of every public step. For years, she stayed well within those edges. Then something shifted. It did not happen overnight, nor did it announce itself with a press release or a public statement. It didn't start with any of the overt signals that the palace watches for when monitoring the behavior of people connected to the royal family. It happened the way the most significant shifts inside royal circles always happen, gradually, quietly, through a series of individually unremarkable moves that only revealed their pattern when viewed together from a sufficient distance. The first thing people close to the situation noticed was the charitable activity. Laura had always maintained some involvement in philanthropic causes. That was expected of anyone in her position, and it was entirely unremarkable on its own. What began to attract attention was the specific direction that involvement started taking. The causes she was lending her name and her presence to began clustering around a particular set of themes: mental health, vulnerable children, social isolation, the people and the issues that the establishment finds easiest to ignore, and Diana had spent her public life refusing to ignore. Individually, each association was defensible. These are important causes. Anyone with a platform and a conscience might reasonably choose to support them. But the accumulation was harder to explain away. Because these were not random selections from the broad landscape of charitable need, they were Diana's territory, specifically, deliberately, and recognizably Diana's territory. Then came the language. Public statements associated with Laura during this period began carrying a particular emotional register, warm, direct, focused on human connection over institutional formality, emphasizing the importance of reaching people who felt unseen and unheard. The words themselves were not Diana's words. Nobody could point to a direct quote and say that a line had been crossed in any technical sense. But the resonance was there. The echo was audible to anyone who had spent time with Diana's actual speeches and interviews, to anyone who understood the specific frequency on which she had communicated with a public that responded to her unlike anyone before or since. Inside the palace, echoes do not go unnoticed. The charitable world that Diana built and that William has maintained is not a loose collection of independent organizations operating without coordination. It is a network, connected by relationships, funding structures, and shared histories going back decades. The people who run the organizations within that network knew Diana personally in many cases. They have worked with William directly. They understand, without needing to be told explicitly, where the boundaries are and who has the standing to cross them. When Laura began cultivating relationships within that network, the calls started, not panicked calls or confrontational ones, but the quiet, careful conversations through which the palace communicates its concerns without ever saying anything that could be repeated in a newspaper. The message was consistent across those conversations, noted, observed, being monitored. What made the situation so extraordinarily delicate was the identity of Laura's mother. If this had been anyone else, anyone without Camilla's position at the center of the current reign, the response would have been straightforward, a clear and private communication about appropriate boundaries, delivered through the relevant channels would have resolved the matter quickly. The palace has managed far more complex situations than an overreaching peripheral figure with charitable ambitions. But Laura was not a peripheral figure in any simple sense. She was the Queen's daughter. Any move William made in her direction was simultaneously a move in Camilla's direction. Any message delivered to Laura was a message that Camilla would receive, and any confrontation, however private and carefully managed, risked detonating in the exact space where the tensions of the current royal family are most combustible. The intersection of the Diana era and the Camilla era, the wound that the monarchy has never fully closed, and that everyone inside the institution knows better than to prod without extraordinary care. William knew all of this. He had grown up inside all of this. He understood the geometry of it in a way that only someone who had lived through the 1990s at close range, as a child watching his parents' marriage collapse in public, could truly understand. So, he did not move immediately. He watched and gathered information. He waited until the picture was complete enough that when he did act, the action would be precise, proportionate, and impossible to reverse. The picture did not take long to complete, and when it was, what William saw was not a woman stumbling accidentally into sensitive territory through charitable enthusiasm and poor judgment about optics. What he saw was a pattern, and patterns in the palace tell a story that individual moments never can. He had heard that story before. He knew exactly how it ended, and he had absolutely no intention of letting it end that way again. The moment William found out, information travels differently inside a royal palace than it does anywhere else. It does not arrive in emails marked urgent, nor does it surface in meetings with agendas and minutes. It moves through conversations held in corridors, through a word exchange after a briefing ends and the room begins to empty, and through a trusted aide who asks to speak privately and chooses the words with extraordinary care, through the slow, deliberate accumulation of detail that the palace machinery has perfected over centuries. Precisely because the alternative, letting things escalate unmanaged until they become crises, is something the institution has paid for too many times to risk again. William received the full picture on a Tuesday. The specific date has not been confirmed by any source, but multiple people with knowledge of the situation place the moment of complete awareness in the autumn. The leaves were turning. The public diary was full. Engagements had been carried out that morning with a composure that William has spent a lifetime developing into something close to an art form. Nobody watching him that day would have seen anything. That is precisely the point. The palace trains its senior members to give nothing away in public, regardless of what is happening in private. William had learned that lesson earlier and harder than anyone. The briefing came from a senior member of his household team, a figure William trusted completely, someone who had been watching the situation develop for weeks, and who had waited until the pattern was clear enough to present without ambiguity. The information was delivered carefully, factually, without editorial commentary that might have colored the way William processed what he was hearing. Good aides understand that their job is to inform, not to interpret. William would do the interpreting himself. He listened without interrupting. That detail matters. People who have been in rooms with William during difficult briefings consistently note the stillness. There was no visible agitation and no immediate reaction, just complete, focused attention directed at the person speaking. It is a quality that observers have traced directly to Elizabeth. She had the same quality, the ability to receive difficult information without allowing the reception of it to become its own event. When the aide finished, William asked 3 questions. The sources who have spoken about this moment have not disclosed the specific content of those questions, but the nature of them can be inferred from what followed. They were precise, and were focused on facts rather than interpretations. They were the questions of a man who was not surprised by what he had heard, but who needed to understand the exact dimensions of it before deciding how to respond. The response, when it came, was not immediate. It was not loud, and it was not directed at Laura Lopes personally. This is the detail that reveals the most about how William operates. A less experienced or less disciplined person in his position might have reached for a direct confrontation. The provocation was real, and the territory being encroached upon was the most sensitive in his entire world. The person doing the encroaching was connected through the most painful possible chain of association to everything William had spent 30 years processing and protecting. The emotional logic of a direct response was entirely understandable, but William did not follow emotional logic. He followed institutional logic. The two are not always the same thing. Inside the palace, they are almost never the same thing. The first move was internal. Senior figures within the royal foundation were contacted, quietly, individually. The conversations that followed were conducted with the careful indirection that palace communication relies on, especially when the stakes are high enough to make plain speaking dangerous. Nobody said Laura Lopes' name in those conversations more than was absolutely necessary. Nobody made accusations or issued ultimatums. What was communicated was that the boundaries around Diana's charitable legacy were being reviewed, and that any external partnerships or relationships that had developed without explicit authorization from the Foundation's senior leadership would need to be reconsidered. The people receiving those communications understood immediately. They had been in the palace world long enough to read the register fluently. Reconsidered was not an invitation to a conversation. It was a conclusion dressed in the language of a process. Within weeks, the landscape had shifted, quietly, without any public announcement or any statement that could be attributed to anyone. The connections that Laura had been cultivating within Diana's charitable network began to loosen. Invitations that had been extended were not followed up. Meetings that had been penciled in were postponed indefinitely. The warmth that Laura had encountered when first moving into that territory cooled to a professional cordiality that communicated, without a single explicit word, that the door was no longer open. Laura would have felt it. The people around her would have felt it. The question of whether Camilla felt it, or was told about it directly, remains one of the most carefully guarded details of this entire episode. What is known is that the atmosphere inside the palace during this period was described by people present within it as extraordinarily taut. The public saw nothing. The engagements continued, and the photographs were taken. The statements were issued. On the surface, the machinery of the monarchy operated with its customary smoothness. Beneath the surface, something significant was being decided, not loudly or dramatically, but with a finality that left no room for appeal or revision. Camilla's position made everything harder to handle. That point cannot be overstated. The woman was queen. Charles was king. Any action William took existed within a family structure that the public understood in one way, and that those inside it experienced in a completely different way. The formal hierarchy placed Camilla above William in the current reign. The emotional and historical hierarchy, the one that operated in the unspoken registers of palace life, placed Diana's memory in a position that no title and ceremony could touch. William had always lived inside that contradiction, Growing up between those two realities had shaped everything about the way he moved through the institution, the formality he could observe, the grief he could not set aside, the duty he embraced, the wound he carried. The Laura situation brought all of it into the same room at the same time. Sources who observed William during this period describe someone who was controlled but not detached. The distinction is important. Detachment would have meant processing the situation purely as an institutional problem to be managed. What those close to him observed was something more personal than that. A man who was protecting something that mattered to him in a way that went far beyond strategy. Who understood that Diana's legacy was not an asset on a balance sheet, but the living continuation of a person he had loved and lost at an age when no child should lose a parent. That understanding did not make William's response emotional in the way that word is usually meant. It made the response precise in a way that purely strategic thinking rarely achieves, because he knew exactly what was at stake, not in the abstract, in the specific, personal, irreducible terms of someone who had been there. The review of external partnerships extended beyond the immediate situation with Laura. William used the moment to conduct a broader assessment of every relationship that touched Diana's charitable legacy, and to establish, with greater clarity than had previously existed in writing, the criteria by which future partnerships would be authorized. The exercise took several months. It involved senior legal and communications figures within the household. When it was complete, the framework that emerged was significantly tighter than anything that had existed before. Laura Lopez was never named in any document connected to that review. She did not need to be. The review existed because of her. Everyone involved knew that. The absence of her name was itself a form of message. It said that what had happened was not personal, it was institutional. It was not about one woman's choices. It was about the protection of something that the institution valued above almost everything else in its current form. That framing was deliberate. It was also, in its own way, the most complete expression of what William had learned from watching Elizabeth operate across 7 decades of reign. Never make it personal when you can make it structural. Don't ever confront when you can contain. Never leave the door open when you have decided it should be closed. The door was closed. Laura Lopez continued to exist within the outer edges of royal life in the way that she always had. The appearances in the photographs continued. The cordiality continued. Everything continued exactly as it had before, with one exception. The territory that mattered most was no longer accessible to her. William had seen to that, quietly, legally, institutionally, and with a thoroughness that left nothing to chance and nothing open to reinterpretation. Diana's legacy remained exactly where William had always intended it to remain. In the hands of the people she would have chosen herself. What it revealed about the monarchy's future. Every institution has a fault line, a place where the contradictions it has accumulated over time run closest to the surface, where the pressure of competing histories, claims, and visions of what the thing is supposed to be pushed hardest against the structures designed to contain it. The British monarchy's fault line has a name. It has had the same name for nearly 30 years, Diana. Not Diana as a person, though the person was extraordinary and the loss was real. The grief that followed her death reshaped the emotional relationship between the monarchy and the public, in ways that are still working themselves out. Diana as a dividing line, as the point at which the story of the modern monarchy splits into 2 versions that have never been fully reconciled, and that the institution has never found a way to hold simultaneously without strain. On one side sits the world Charles built, the second marriage, the rehabilitation, the patient, decade-long reconstruction of a public image that had been devastated, ruined by the events of the 1990s. Camilla at the center of that world, accepted, titled, publicly installed as Queen Consort and now Queen. Everything that Charles had wanted and waited for, and finally, in the last chapter of a long life, achieved. On the other side sits everything Diana left behind, the public love, the charitable framework, the sons who carry her face and her memory into every room they enter, the values she championed so publicly, and so personally that they became inseparable from her identity. And William, standing at the center of that side of the line, holding it with a quiet ferocity that the palace has learned over many years never to underestimate. The Laura Lopez episode did not create that fault line. The fault line was already there, running beneath the surface of every family gathering, of every joint public appearance, and every carefully worded palace statement, designed to project an image of unity that those inside the institution know to be more complicated than it looks. What the episode did was illuminate it, suddenly and completely. Because what Laura's repositioning represented, whatever the intent behind it, was a movement across that line. A figure from the Charles and Camilla world reaching toward the territory that William has defined through years of deliberate and sustained work as Diana's, as his, as belonging to a lineage that runs from his mother through him to his children, and that does not extend sideways into the family his father constructed after the marriage ended. William's response illuminated something equally important. It revealed the shape of the monarchy he is building. It is not a monarchy of open borders and fluid relationships, not a monarchy where the past is managed through forgiveness and the future is constructed through inclusion. That version of the monarchy exists in press releases. It exists in the carefully managed photographs of family occasions where everyone smiles. And the caption implies a warmth that the body language sometimes contradicts. The monarchy William is building has walls, specific, deliberate, institutionally embedded walls around the things that matter most, around Diana's legacy, around the royal foundation's direction, and around the question of who gets to stand close to the causes and the values. No one comes near the symbolic territory that he has spent 15 years constructing into something durable and significant. Those walls are not built from hostility. That distinction matters enormously, and it is one that observers of William consistently make. The walls are built from clarity, from a vision of what the monarchy needs to be in order to survive the next 50 years that William has developed. Through close observation of where the institution has failed in the past, and fierce determination not to repeat those failures. Diana was one of those failures, the most visible and most costly one. A woman of extraordinary gifts and genuine public connection who was allowed to fall through the gaps of an institution that did not know how to hold her. William was 15 years old when it happened, old enough to understand what was occurring, young enough to be marked by it in ways that have shaped every significant decision of his adult life. The foundation of his response to the Laura situation rests on that marking, on the knowledge, personal and irreducible, of what happens when the palace fails to protect what matters, when it allows competing interests and competing claims to go unmanaged, until the damage is done and the person is gone, and all that remains is the grief, guilt, and the 30-year project of trying to honor someone who deserved better while the institution was still capable of giving it to her. William is not going to let that happen again. Not to Diana's memory, not to Catherine, definitely not to the version of the monarchy that he is quietly and systematically building for his children to inherit. The Laura episode also revealed something significant about the current balance of power within the institution. Because William acted and the action held, there was no escalation, no counter-move from the Camilla side of the family that reversed or complicated what William had put in place. The boundaries he drew remained where he drew them. The framework he established around Diana's charitable legacy remained intact. The connections that had been loosened stayed loose. That outcome tells a story about where real authority inside the monarchy currently resides. Charles holds the formal position. The crown sits on his head. The constitutional powers are his. But the emotional authority, the capacity to define what the monarchy means to the public and to shape the direction it moves in, that sits with William. It has been sitting with William for longer than the formal hierarchy acknowledges. Elizabeth understood this dynamic. People who observed her relationship with William in the final years of her reign describe a woman who was conducting a deliberate transfer of institutional wisdom. And she did it to the person she believed would need it most, not through formal instruction or proximity, but through the conversation she chose to have and the access she chose to give. Also through the quiet but unmistakable signals of confidence that she directed toward him consistently. William received that transfer. He has been applying for it ever since. The Laura Lopez episode is, in the end, a story about inheritance. Not jewelry or estates or the contents of a private vault, but the inheritance of a way of operating, a set of instincts about how power works inside a monarchy, and how it must be protected. A story about how the lines that matter most must be drawn and held, regardless of the personal or political cost of drawing them. Elizabeth drew those lines throughout her reign. William watched and learned, and when the moment came to draw one of his own, he drew it with precision and a permanence that would have been entirely recognizable to the woman who taught him how. Camilla retained her title. Laura retained her place in the outer edges of royal life. The formal structure of the family continued to function with its customary surface composure. Nothing was said publicly. Nothing needed to be. But inside the palace, in the network of relationships and the framework of the royal foundation, and the quietly restructured landscape of Diana's charitable legacy, the message was clear to everyone capable of reading it. William had drawn the line had held, and the monarchy that would eventually pass from Charles to William, from the generation that had caused the wound to the generation that was determined to heal it, would be built on William's terms. Diana's legacy would remain exactly what William had made it: living, funded, protected, and entirely beyond the reach of anyone who had not earned the right to stand near it. That was not a small thing. Inside the institution, it was everything. And the man who had walked behind his mother's coffin at 15 years old, in front of the entire watching world, had made absolutely certain that the world she had fought to change would remember her on her own terms, not anyone else's, his mother's. This is what the palace never puts in a press release: the real decisions, the quiet actions, the lines drawn in private that shape everything the public eventually sees. William is building something, brick by brick, boundary by boundary, with a patience and a purpose that most people watching from the outside have not yet fully understood. If this story made you see the monarchy differently, tell us in the comments below. And if you want to keep following the stories the palace would rather you never heard, subscribe now. Because what is coming next is something nobody inside those walls saw coming either.